Bob, can you begin by just reminding me why it was that you played less cricket than other bowlers of your talent by the time we got to 54?
Well, I'd played quite a lot of cricket, but in the Bradford League, the war intervened quite a bit with my career. It started when I was 15, and I missed 6 years, like most people, but I did play in the league. I'd been a successful schoolboy cricketer, playing for Bradford Boys, and taking 5 for 5 in the final of the elementary schools Yorkshire competition against Sheffield. But of course I missed then a number of years with the war, and it was really a question of starting again. I went in the Navy at the end of the war. When I came out, I joined the Bradford League Club, played for a few years, learnt my apprenticeship, as you might say, in the league. And by the time I was called up for the Yorkshire second team, I was 26 years old, and I played 3 times in 1950 rather. And then in 1952 I got in the first team, but I developed a fast off spinner by that time, bowling off the middle finger as opposed to conventional. And my career progressed from there, but I had a successful season in 1951. But then in 52 I was taken ill with tuberculosis and spent the next 11 months in hospital. That was a reason for missing out quite a bit of cricket. And I had the top half of my left lung removed. I had to change my style then when I came back. So I missed the 2 seasons, 52 and 53. By 1954, I'd got back in the Yorkshire side, and I was picked for England at Trent Bridge against Pakistan in the first Test match.
You had a fantastic season in 1954, 200 wickets for the second time, I think.
No, not quite. I had 200 wickets in 1951.
Right.
But then when I came back, I changed my style a bit. I think I had something like 154 wickets and bowled about 1,000 over. So, you know, it was quite a reasonable achievement after having had the lung operation.
When you say you changed your style, how would you describe the bowler you had become?
Well, initially I was a seam bowler and swing bowler, trying to bowl outswing. And then once I'd had the lung operation, or actually before then, I could bowl off spinners. I'd been shown how to bowl an off spinner off the conventional off spin as a schoolboy. But like all schoolboys, I wanted to bowl as quick as I could. And I was reasonably successful in the league. I became a professional in the league. So it was a good learning experience. But what happened when I was practicing the off spin, I got a blister on this finger.
Right.
And I had to change then. I didn't have to, but I thought it might be an idea to start bowling off this finger. And I found I could bowl almost at full pace because you've so much extra power with the 2 fingers behind the ball as opposed to just one. And then my stock ball then became a fast off spinner or cutter, as some people described it. Obviously, less time your hand is on the ball, less rotation you're going to get. And therefore, bowling quick, it was the fingers on the ball less. I didn't get as much rotation, but by the extra speed, that gave me the advantage I needed to turn it from the straight.
I've sort of a right-handed Derek Underwood. I mean, would it be true to say that he's probably the nearest in speed and type?
I think possibly, but I think he bowled off the conventional, his left arm, of course, but off the forefinger. I could bowl much quicker than that.
Changes of pace came naturally, did they?
That came later. The first season when I took 200 wickets in 1951, a lot of the wickets were from this fast off spin cutter. A lot of them were caught in the leg trap. I could, at that time, you could have as many fielders as you wanted on the leg side. often we'd have 4 or even 5.
Gosh.
Close to the bat. And I had a brilliant set of fielders in Frank Lawson and Fred Truman, Vic Wilson, Norman Yardley, Leonard. They were all picking catches up, you know, off the end of the bat almost. So
what line were you bowling?
Well,
I mean, if it was turning, is it?
Well, at that time, I'd be bowling on the off stump and at leg and middle, tucking the batsman in. And but then, of course, things changed after that when they limited the leg side field to 5. But that's another story. I mean, it necessitated my having to change when I came out of hospital. I didn't have the power, upper body strength, so I then reverted to bowling off the forefinger again, the off spin. But then I didn't bowl as quick. I could still bowl a quick one because I ran off 16 yards, and if you run off 16 yards, as I did, you can bowl at 80 mile an hour, you can bowl at 50 mile an hour, and the various paces in between. So that was a second chapter in my bowling career. When I got to Australia, it became more important to change pace even more and flight the ball more. And flight is something which is quite different, and very few people teach flight, know how to do it, in fact. I found that to flight the ball, you got to let it go above your head, behind you, the vertical as it were, and get your hand in front and get rotation. Pardon me. So, but that all became necessary when I got to Australia, and I found out the stuff I was bowling in England wasn't really being effective.
Just before we talk about getting to Australia, when did you hear that you had been selected, and how?
Well, I had an idea when I played in the first Test match at Trent Bridge. I'd taken 5 wickets in the first innings against Pakistan, and Dennis Compton had scored 260 odd, and we won by an innings and plenty. But I wasn't chosen for any other Test matches after that. I was assured that it wouldn't affect my chances of getting on the boat to Australia. So I had an idea I might be picked, but then it's quite a long story in a way, because the selectors must have had a very difficult time.
Because there were so many good bowlers.
Well, I mean, the people who were left behind were Locke and Laker, for instance, who'd been to the West Indies previously. Then the fast bowlers, of course. Frank Tyson was chosen, and possibly a lot would say ahead of Freddie Truman, who was left behind. At that time, there were a lot of good bowlers about in England, and I think that's the main reason why we managed to beat Australia. We had such a good variety. Johnny Wardle, of course, was a great left-arm orthodox bowler, but by which time he learnt to bowl his Chinaman and his Goodley. Then I bowled the various, change of pace and flight, etc. But the main reason for our success was Frank Tyson, who really bowled quick, the quickest I've ever seen anybody bowl, and Brian Stathen, who hardly bowled a bad ball on the tour, and he had to be played all the time. So they bowled more than perhaps 70% of the overs.
Have you ever considered that if Fred Truman had gone rather than Frank Tyson, whether England would have won?
Well, it's difficult to say, but Frank Tyson at that time was the quickest bowler probably in the world.
Yep.
And it made all the difference, his extra pace.
Was it Len Hutton who had spotted that possibility in him, do you think?
Yes. Len always believed that fast bowlers won matches in Australia. He often said that to me on the boat going out, because he used to take me on side on many occasions, and we'd talk. He'd try to prepare me for what was going to come. I mean, I'd only played one Test match, and at Trent Bridge, at that stage. But I was 30 years old, so I'd had quite a good apprenticeship. But Frank was quick, and I think Len saw his potential. And therefore, they worked a little bit with him. There were one or two journalists out there. Bill Bowes was a journalist who played in the Bodyline tour, of course, and also the Surrey bowler, the quick bowler, who also took 200 wickets in a season.
Peter Logan.
No. Oh. The journalist by which time, the fast bowler pre-war.
Alf Gover.
Alf Gover, yes, who'd also coached, and they shortened his run a bit. And Frank then he got into a rhythm, which really was as good as he'd ever been, I think. And as I say, some of the best fast bowling I've ever seen.
Just as he's going off purely at a tangent, but you interest me there in that Bill Bowes was called in, people like Ian Peebles are on the tour, a lot of cricketers around, as there are now on television. But,
yeah, but it
they
were closer.
That's just what I've
well,
seen.
we went by boat, you see, and that was 23 days. And we mingled with them, we got to know them very well, and they got to know us. So it wasn't too difficult to bring them in for advice, and they were happy to give it, of course.
Well, you had a long run in at the start of the tour, didn't you, as they don't get these days. And did that help you to adapt to Australian conditions? Yeah,
well, they were so different, yes. You realise, in my case, I realised that my style of bowling wasn't going to get the results, and therefore I had to be experimenting and finding something a bit different, and it was more essential to have a change of pace and a variation.
And was there more bounce, generally speaking?
More
off the pitches? Were, I mean, presumably pitches, they were harder.
The pitches were very hard, yes. I found it very difficult to run, to run into bowl. It was like running on concrete. You were sliding as opposed to digging in. And I mean, after English conditions, when sometimes it's very, very wet and you're sliding all over the place, it was hard there. And Frank Tyson, he must have had some good advice before he went, because he had all his spikes sharpened at the end. So, but it was, I mean, the pitch is shone.
Yeah. You played in Ceylon on the way over, hadn't you? At Sri Lanka, as it now is, and you picked up an injury there.
Yes, that was a bit unfortunate, because after the match, the crowds ran onto the field. They get quite excited, or they did in those days, maybe today. On the previous tour, the players had to run to the pavilion, and the crowds chased after them and set fire to the pavilion, and had to get out of the back way. And then this guy, we were aware of that, you see, so we shot off to the pavilion, and the crowds were trying to beat us, and this youth was pushed ahead of me, and his head hit me right on the rib where I'd had this lung operation, and it was quite painful, and I couldn't breathe afterwards, and eventually I got to an X-ray. On the ship, that was only a small little thing which didn't show anything. By the time we got to Fremantle, which was another 5 days later, I got to the hospital and had an X-ray there, and they found that my rib was cracked, and of course you can't do anything about it and just let it heal normally.
So how long did it take you before you could bowl flat out?
Well, it must have taken a couple of weeks or something like that, or probably something like that.
Did you know whether you were going to be a part of the Test series?
No. No. I suppose we're all fighting for places. I mean, apart from the two quick bowlers who really found themselves on the sheet, there was Alec Bence, of course, who'd been the premier bowler, and he'd been very successful against the Australians and in Australia. But he'd got shingles on the boat going out, and sadly, he hadn't recovered from it by the time we got to Brisbane. We were playing Brisbane in the Test match. And when the team was picked for the next match, which would be Sydney, he was left out. And because we managed to win that match, we lost the first match by an innings and 154 runs, I think it was. in Brisbane, but we won at Sydney by quite a small margin. In fact, all the matches were very, very tight on that series, low scoring. Took quite a while to score runs. The pitches, I don't remember them being all that bad. They were different.
Was it just a case then that the bowling on both sides maybe was a little bit better than the batting, and particularly on England's side?
I think so, yes. Australia, I believe they only scored more than 300 on one occasion at Adelaide in the first innings, apart from Brisbane, when they scored 600. I don't think we scored more than 300 on more than one occasion. So the scores were low. Our bowling was better than the Australians. We had a big variety of bowlers.
You played from the second test onwards. Can you remember again the circumstances in which you were told that you were going to be a part of the big time, as it were?
Well, you didn't really get to know until the morning of the match. So, but I suppose once you've, in my case, because I didn't have a lot of success at Sydney, I played my part, but the main success was Frank Tyson and Brian Statham. But I wouldn't know until I saw the team sheet that went up whether I was playing or not. But then when we'd won the Sydney one, the team wasn't changed then very much, so I had a pretty good idea I'd be playing then, and I was getting better and more confident.
You say you learnt flight along the way. Were there other bowlers you were able to talk to about the skills?
Very few. I've only ever spoken to one bowler about flight, and that's Wilfred Rhodes.
Really?
And he finished in about 1920s anyhow. But he was a master of flight.
So you had already talked to him. Did you get
to see him a little bit, but I can't remember having been given the answer. Through experimenting, I found out how to do it.
And was there a moment when the penny dropped, so to speak, or did it come gradually?
I probably didn't know exactly how I did it to explain to anybody else, but my bowling, as I say, because I learned to release the ball before the vertical and get my hand going ahead of the ball, it enabled me to bowl a different ball.
Do you think height, when it comes to flight, that height, and you're a tall bowler, is an advantage or not?
I think once you get the ball above the eye line of the batsman, it's an advantage, yeah. Well, a small bowler can do it, you know, a shorter bowler can do it, but generally speaking, I think it's an advantage.
From a personal point of view, which are the matches or even the moments in the matches that stand out all these years later?
Well, the Adelaide match that stands out better than anywhere else. In that we were 2-1 up when we went to Adelaide. If we'd have lost, we'd have been back to square one. The fact that we won meant that we won the series, and Sydney then, which was interrupted by rain, it didn't matter. So that was a draw. But I had quite an interesting Test career, although it was short. I played 9 times for England, but I was never on the losing side. I missed the Brisbane Test. And we won 7 and we drew 2. Those 2 we'd have won because the weather intervened and helped the opposition.
Who were your muckers on the tour? I mean, how would you spend your evenings and things?
Well, we had 4 Yorkshiremen, of course, in the side, and I shared the cabins on the way out with Johnny Wardle. And then in going around Australia, I shared rooms with Vic Wilson. So, you know, it's fairly easy to get acclimatised with the team. You see, I'd only played 1 Test before, and I hadn't met them too much. No. Only on the other side when we were playing county cricket.
Did you always get on well with Johnny Wardle, or was there a bit of rivalry?
Well, there's plenty of rivalry. Well, you can't expect anything else from Yorkshiremen.
So, I mean, even playing at Headingley, there were times when you would have fancied his end and vice versa.
Yeah, well, no, because we were different, you see, and that was the advantage. There were times when I might have, because at Headingley, playing in county cricket, I used to open with a new ball with Fred, but I mean, Fred used to have the downhill and with the wind behind him. The rest of us had to bowl uphill and into the wind. So, but as soon as Fred came off, I could then go to the other end and start bowling spinners from his end, which was especially at Headingley downhill, which I preferred to do. And Johnny wanted the uphill anyhow from this football end. So.
Was Len Hutton a very different captain from Norman Yardley, with whom you played at Yorkshire?
They both had the same. They both had a huge knowledge of the game and of opposition players. They were different in some respects, yes. Norman was quite easygoing. He was a kind of captain who he would lead from the front. He was an extremely good cricketer. If there was a crisis on bat a ball, he'd go in and sort it out, and he could do that. If things were tough with the ball, then he would take an end and he'd probably get a wicket. It was incredible. He got Bradman out a number of times, didn't he? And his batting was likewise. He was always prepared to go in, and if it required someone to play for the draw, for the end of the game, then he could do that. If it had to go in and get runs quickly, he'd do that. He was an amateur, and of course amateurs did have a bit more freedom than a professional. They weren't playing for the living. And so in those days, the amateur had a very important role to play in the game. And he was an amateur captain, whereas Len was a professional captain. Len was more probably intense and maybe a bit, well, more professional, yeah.
Were there times, even in Australia, even when Frank Tyson was obviously the spearhead of the attack, when you felt, I do wish Len would put me on now?
Well, there were a number of times, yes. The match you were talking about earlier, that's in my memory still, and that's Adelaide, because whilst we did win in the end, it was a very tight match. And I really came into my own as I got closer to 100% efficiency with my bowling than any other time in my career.
And what were the wickets that stand out for you now?
Well, I was fairly fortunate. I got Colin MacDonald out time to time, and Neil Harvey 2 or 3 times, and Richie Benno a few times. The way it turned out, the wickets I took were all the 11 wickets I took in the series were all the first 6 batsmen. There were times like you might have been referring to when I wanted to get on. I'd got 3 wickets from about 12 runs of 13 runs at Adelaide in the second innings, and I couldn't get on again after Len put Frank and Brian on, and they mopped the tail up, and we only had to get 94 to win. So that was one of those occasions you're talking about.
Neil Harvey was probably their most prolific player at that stage. Did you find him particularly difficult to bowl against, or did you like left-handers?
Well, I didn't mind, actually, and I did get his wicket, I think, 3 times. But he played the best innings of the tour on one occasion when I think he scored 92 and nearly won the match for them with
Melbourne.
Bill Johnston at the other end. I can't quite remember which. Was it?
Melbourne, I think.
Was that Melbourne? Yes,
Yeah.
that would be Melbourne. That was the best innings I've ever seen anybody play, because against Frank and Brian and Johnny and myself, he really did stop us winning a lot easier.
These days, off-spinners, it seems to get on a tour, have to have a ball that spins away from a right-handed batsman by whatever means. Did you have that?
Bowling off-spin, with an off-spinner's grip I didn't, but I did have a ball that George Pope, there were 2 brothers Popes, weren't they, played for Derbyshire.
Yep.
George Pope had a means of bowling a cutter, a leg cutter, and the way he did it, he showed me this, he held the ball like this, similar to what I I did for my off cutter when I was bowling off two fingers, but same thing when it off one. He had that finger underneath the ball, and what he did was to flick that finger upwards like that. Difficult to tell for a batsman because it was just a finger, and that spun the ball, and it spun like a spinning top in his hand. And he showed me this one evening when we'd been to a cricket dinner, and I practiced that. And I mean, you can't set a field for both and bowl too many of each. No. You've got to bowl it every couple of overs or something like that. But that's one ball I did develop. But it didn't get me too many wickets, but at least it makes you the batsman, if it knows you've got one, to be looking for it, as well as change of pace.
Did you talk to Alec Bedser about his leg cutter?
Eric?
Alec.
Oh, Alec. Well, I know how Alec bowled it. I mean, he sort of rolled his wrist over the ball to bowl his leg cut. I mean, he bowled the best leg cut of anybody.
And quicker, of course.
Yes, and I mean, I was with it in the nets, and I knew how he did it. But the George Pope one was different. He just flicked that finger up, and it's harder to tell for the batsman.
You moved on to New Zealand after winning the Ashes, and that rain-affected game at Sydney. And by comparison with Australia, was that relatively easy from a cricketing point of view?
Well, the pitches were more like they were in England. The New Zealand team in those days weren't as good as they are today, I don't think. But they had two world-class players in John Reid and Bert Sutcliffe, the left-hander. He was a very fine player. But against our attack, I mean, they just weren't good enough. We'd beaten Australia with this attack, and they were nowhere near as good a side as Australia. And in fact, in the last Test match at Auckland, we bowled them out for 26, which is still the lowest score in Test history. So I think that answers your question.
Was that a wet pitch, or just you were just too
There was
good?
something in the pitch for spin, yes. Yeah.
And socially, was it fun? Did you get a chance to go around the country?
Yes, we did. We were there a month after Australia. The whole tour lasted something like 6 months and 3 weeks, I think, altogether. We had the last month in New Zealand, and they looked after us very well, and it's a wonderful country. We played in Wellington, and we played in Auckland and Dunedin and Christchurch and Auckland. The 2 Test matches in those days.
And were you able to keep contact with home throughout 6 months away?
Not very easily, only by letter. If you wanted to make a phone call, you had to book in advance, and it didn't always come through at the time you booked, and it might be the next day. So, and then the time change, of course, made it difficult. So it wasn't all that easy.
After you played a very big part in bringing back the Ashes for England, and yet, as you say, you really only played a double handful of Test matches.
That's right.
Was that, looking back, a big disappointment?
In some respects it was, but the fact that I played my Test career after the lung operation, so it was all a bonus, really.
Yes, as you say, that Sydney Test, the second Test, England having lost the first, was a very tight match.
Yes, it was.
And you actually got rather important runs, particularly in the second innings there.
I think I did better with the bat than the ball. But I know Johnny Wardle in the first innings, he did very well. And then in the second, with Brian Statham, and then in the second innings, Brian and I put on 46, I think.
For the last wicket.
Which we really enjoyed, because although we were bowlers, we all enjoyed batting. We weren't terribly good. And in those days, especially in county cricket, if you're a bowler and you were going in 9, 10, 11, then the idea was to get some quick runs and get out, and because you were losing winning time by staying and prodding about. But in this match, Brian and I really enjoyed ourselves, and we weren't nervous at all. We just poked and hit, and we put on this 46, but we only won by 38 at the end of the day, so it was quite an achievement.
As I recall, Brian was really no sort of batsman to speak of, was he?
It had quite a good eye. A bit like Fred Truman. He could hit the ball.
Bat.
Yeah.
How seriously did you take your batting?
Well, I really tried. But generally speaking, I know in county cricket, I think I went 5 matches without a bat because our batting was so good. And we played 3-day cricket, of course, not 4-day. 4-day cricket, the tail enders have a better chance of becoming better batsmen.
How long did you spend in the nets batting as opposed to bowling?
Well, as long as they let me, but they used to call time after about 5 minutes.
and bowling?
Slight exaggeration of that.
Yeah,
I bowled until I was, I couldn't bowl anymore. I like to bowl in the nets. I practice a lot.
And throughout that tour, you would have bowled pretty well every day, would you?
Yes, we did. Yeah, and that was something that was important to me. I mean, you have to practice. There's lots of things you can do as a bowler. You can create an illusion, for instance, when you're bowling. If you're only off 16 yards, as I said earlier, you can bowl at 80 mile an hour, or you can bowl at 50 mile an hour. But then you can create an illusion. As you get into pitch, you can start waving your arms about as if you're going to bowl a quick one and bowl a slow one. And especially, there's so many ways you can bowl with your wrist like this. You can bowl with your wrist underneath, like Wilfred Dodge used to bowl like this, left-handed, of course. Ed Laverty bowled more like that, generally speaking. But you can bowl with your arm here, here, or here. You can, as I say, bowl here, here, or there. And to be able to do that with confidence in the middle, you've just got to practice in the net.
What about the angle of delivery, where your feet were?
Well, you can do that, of course. You get close to the wicket, which I tended to do. But then you can bowl wide of the crease every now and then. Or you can bowl a yard back. That was something that creates a variation for the batsman. You've just got to try to put the ball where the batsman doesn't think it is.
Did you pre-plan every ball you bowled, or did you sometimes
Walking back to my mark, yes, that was important as well. This question of concentration, which I was a great believer in. It's all right telling someone to concentrate, but unless you learn the method of concentration, and I did this through learning the yoga system. And as I was walking back to my mark, there was a word that, or 2 words, that I'd read about in this book for helping you to concentrate, and it was Sim-La. And as I was walking back to my mark, I just wanted to be getting into my own cocoon. I didn't want anybody distracting me. I mean, the crowds are bad enough because in Australia they make a lot of noise. But I get back to my mark, and it's no good trying to concentrate when you're starting your run-up if you're running off 16 yards, because the average concentration, it's something I'd read, and I don't know whether it's true scientifically, but the average person can concentrate for something like 3 seconds with intense concentration. And the great players, like Len Hutton or Jack Nicklaus, or they've perhaps a 5-second concentration period. Therefore, I used to learn to concentrate in my delivery stride, because I think if you try to concentrate too early, it's gone by you get to the important point of delivering the ball. So again, you need to practice this, and you don't try to learn in the middle, you do it in the nets, and that's why I think net practice is so important. The other thing about the tour, which we didn't mention, was the role that Geoffrey Howard played in the tour. He was a manager, and he was a very professional manager. He'd been Secretary of Lancashire and Surrey at the time, I believe. And he had a great relationship with Len Hutton. And I think he valued the contribution that the Yorkshire contingent made on that tour. Not just those of us who played, but we also had people like Bill Bowes, who was a journalist who had played in in the Bodyline Tour in 1932. John Baptist, Jim Kilburn, Yorkshire journalists, and so it fitted in very well being a Yorkshireman in that tour. We weren't on our own.
And Geoffrey was a chap who could sort of rise above any regional differences.
Yes, he did. I think he took a lot of the weight from Len's shoulders on purpose.
Can I just, I'm fascinated by what you were saying about concentration. And you said you as you were walking back, let's say you were bowling at Neil Harvey and he'd just driven you through the covers for 4. I'm sure it didn't happen very often.
Well,
but I mean, and you wanted just to hold the next one back, say, would you, at what stage would you be planning that?
Oh, as I'm walking back to my mark.
Right.
Yeah.
But then your intense concentration as you delivered was on just the length the next one was coming.
In the delivery stride, yes, yeah. And of course you plan in your own, on good pitches against good players. You really have to work hard. You haven't to bowl bad balls. And furthermore, you don't try to experiment too much against good players on good pitches, because they're going to get runs. Therefore, every ball has got to be a good one. And something that I've always remembered when I was playing, and that was something that Yorkshire had a player called Emmett Robinson, a bowler and batsman in the 20s. And he once said to me, he was a coach here, he said, "I know if there's got to be a bowler, there's got to bowl 5 good balls and over, and 6 hasn't to be a bad one." I thought about that so much.